Imagine the happiest day of your life, your wedding day. The laughter of loved ones, the beauty of tradition, and the promise of a future filled with love. Now imagine, in the midst of that joy, a secret so heavy it threatens to unravel everything. This is the story of Amina, a young bride whose life took an unexpected turn at the very moment she was meant to celebrate her future. A story that begins with a celebration, spirals into chaos, and transforms into a journey of resilience, love, and redemption. But this isn't just about Amina, it's about us, about the judgments we carry, the strength it takes to break them, and the courage needed to embrace truth, even when it shakes the foundation of everything we believe. What happened during Amina's wedding day changed her life forever, and it challenged an entire village to face its own flaws. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about one woman's struggle. It's about the power of community, the depth of forgiveness, and the unyielding strength of a mother's love. By the end, you'll see how one moment, one choice, can spark a transformation that ripples through generations. And here's the question. When faced with a truth that challenges everything you thought you knew, would you stand firm, or would you open your heart to something greater? Let's find out. The day started with an air of anticipation as the village buzzed with activity. Women prepared fragrant dishes, the aroma of spices filling the air, while men raised the ceremonial canopy under the sprawling baobab tree. The children giggled and chased each other, their energy mirroring the excitement of the adults. Amina, adorned in a dazzling white gown embroidered with gold, stepped out of her family's hut, her beauty radiating like the first light of dawn. Yet behind her composed smile, a flicker of unease passed across her face, unnoticed by most but piercing to those who paid close attention. Elder Bayo, perched on a wooden stool beneath a mango tree, studied Amina with a discerning eye. "She carries more than joy in her heart today," he muttered softly, stroking his chin. The other elders dismissed his comment with light laughter, chalking it up to his natural skepticism. Meanwhile, Kwame stood proudly near the sacred tree, his friends slapping him on the back in celebration. His confidence was evident, but even he couldn't fully grasp the weight of the moment. It was a day of dreams, but dreams often come tethered to hidden truths. The vibrant colors of the celebration contrasted with the growing whispers among the older women. They admired Amina's dress but commented on her unusually measured steps. Her mother, walking a pace behind, adjusted Amina's veil as if to shield her from more than just the sun. The music shifted to a softer rhythm, signaling the approach of the ceremony. All eyes turned toward the sacred tree, where the couple would exchange vows. The elders fell silent, their attention sharpening as if sensing an invisible thread pulling taut. As Amina approached Kwame under the sacred tree, the crowd's cheers rose like a wave. But her steps faltered momentarily, her grip tightening on the bouquet in her hands. Kwame reached out, steadying her with a reassuring touch that elicited more cheers. Amina nodded and smiled, yet her expression betrayed a deeper conflict she couldn't mask. The drums began again, louder and more insistent, ushering in the moment everyone had been waiting for. Beneath the shade of the baobab, the stage was set for a celebration no one would forget. The sacred tree stood tall and majestic, its roots intertwined with the history of the village. It wasn't just a backdrop, it was a witness to generations of unions and promises. The villagers took their seats on wooden benches, their eyes fixed on the couple. The children settled down, their laughter replaced by quiet awe. Amina and Kwame stood beneath the tree, the soft glow of sunlight filtering through its branches, creating a halo-like effect. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, until a gust of wind sent Amina's veil fluttering, almost like a premonition whispering in the air. The ceremony began with the village elder's deep, resonant voice, calling for blessings on the union. Elder Bayo, always observant, shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering between Amina's trembling hands and her downcast eyes. The community's focus was on the vows, but his was on the bride, piecing together the subtle signs. Amina's sisters, seated in the front row, exchanged nervous glances. Their smiles were polite but strained, as though they shared a secret that no one else could fathom. Kwame, oblivious to the growing tension, recited his vows with pride and conviction. His voice carried over the crowd, drawing smiles and nods of approval. Amina's turn came, and she hesitated, her voice trembling as she began to speak. The words of love and commitment flowed, but her tone lacked the certainty Kwame's had. The crowd leaned in, some exchanging puzzled looks. Even the sacred tree, ancient and unyielding, seemed to sense the shift in energy. As the elders blessed the couple with chants and prayers, Amina's discomfort became harder to ignore. Her hands clutched her bouquet tightly, the white flowers trembling as if mirroring her own nerves. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead, and she discreetly wiped it away with a trembling hand. Kwame glanced at her, concern flashing across his face, but she offered him a small, reassuring smile. Yet, deep within, she knew this day carried more than vows. It carried the weight of secrets waiting to surface. As the ceremony progressed, the rhythmic chants of the elders filled the air, creating a sacred ambience that demanded reverence. The villagers swayed gently to the rhythm, their expressions a mixture of joy and solemnity. Amina stood beside Kwame, her fingers interlocked with his, but her grip tightened with every passing moment. The sacred vows were meant to bind two souls together, yet Amina felt as though they were stitching a fragile patchwork over an unraveling truth. Each chant seemed to echo louder in her mind, blending with the pounding of her heart. From the back rows, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some noticed Amina's unusual demeanor, while others dismissed it as mere nerves. Elder Bayo, however, remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on her every movement. The sun's rays pierced through the tree's canopy, spotlighting the couple as if nature itself demanded attention to the moment. Amina's mother, seated close by, wrung her hands nervously, her lips moving in silent prayer. She knew her daughter well enough to see that something was amiss, yet the ceremony marched forward, unstoppable and unyielding. Kwame, ever the steady presence, gave Amina a reassuring squeeze on her hand. His smile was warm, unshakable, but she barely met his gaze. Instead, her eyes flitted toward the crowd, searching for something, or perhaps someone, hidden in the sea of faces. Her breath hitched as her gaze locked briefly with Elder Bayo's piercing eyes, sending a shiver down her spine. The elder's expression was unreadable, but his intensity seemed to bore into her soul, as if silently asking the questions she so desperately wanted to avoid. As the final blessings were pronounced, Amina felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the midday sun. The crowd erupted in applause, the joyous sounds ringing through the village, but her relief was fleeting. The ceremony had ended, but the day had only begun. Beneath the applause, a storm was brewing, a storm no amount of prayers or blessings could quell. The crowd gathered closely around the sacred tree, its massive trunk a silent witness to the vows about to be exchanged. The air was thick with tradition, every movement steeped in symbolism. The elders formed a semicircle around Amina and Kwame, their voices steady as they recited prayers for unity and prosperity. The children, seated cross-legged at the edges, stared in wonder, their faces lit with curiosity. For the villagers, this wasn't just a wedding, it was a reaffirmation of the bonds that held their community together. But for Amina, the moment felt more like a thread unraveling than a knot being tied. Amina's voice faltered as she began her vows, her words trembling like leaves in a breeze. Her hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Kwame turned slightly toward her, his eyes filled with quiet encouragement. The villagers exchanged murmurs, some leaning forward to catch every word. Elder Bayo, standing near the altar, folded his arms across his chest, his expression as grave as a storm cloud. He watched Amina intently, sensing that her struggle was deeper than mere stage fright. The sacred tree's roots seemed to hum beneath his feet, as if nature itself recognized the unease in the air. The elders continued the ritual, sprinkling sacred water around the couple to symbolize purification and new beginnings. Amina flinched as the cool droplets landed on her skin, though she quickly masked her discomfort. Kwam's voice broke through the tension, strong and unwavering as he recited his vows with pride. His words painted a picture of a future filled with love, partnership, and shared dreams. The villagers smiled and nodded, their faith in Kwame unshakable, but their gazes kept returning to Amina, who seemed lost in a storm of her own thoughts. From her place among the gathered crowd, Zainab, Amina's closest friend, watched with growing concern. She could see the tiny, almost imperceptible tremors in Amina's hands and the way her gaze darted nervously toward the crowd. Zainab knew Amina better than anyone, and what she saw now wasn't the radiant bride they had dreamed about as children. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Zainab's heart ached with the weight of her silent observation. The tension beneath the sacred tree grew as the ritual progressed, subtle but undeniable. Amina's words stumbled again, her voice barely audible against the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Her hands, clasping the ceremonial staff, trembled slightly, the delicate gold bangles around her wrists jingling faintly. Kwame stood steady beside her, his presence like an anchor in the rising tide of unease. The elders exchanged glances, their years of wisdom warning them that something beneath this picture-perfect ceremony was amiss. Yet the ritual pressed forward, the weight of tradition leaving no room for hesitation. The villagers watched with bated breath, their expressions a mixture of joy and curiosity. Elder Fatima, seated among the elders, leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she focused on Amina's face. "She carries more than a bride's nerves today," Fatima whispered to Elder Bayo, who nodded but remained silent. The sacred vows, spoken in the language of their ancestors, resonated through the air like a melody. But to Amina, each word felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her secret grew with every syllable she uttered. Kwame's family sat proudly in the front row, their eyes brimming with pride and approval. His mother, dressed in vibrant royal blue, held her head high, a smile of satisfaction on her lips, but her smile faltered as she noticed the slight quiver in Amina's voice. She exchanged a quick glance with Kwame's father, who shrugged dismissively, unwilling to let any doubts cloud the day. To them, this ceremony was not just about the union of two individuals, but the uniting of two respected families, a foundation that must not crack under scrutiny. Amina stole a glance at Zainab, whose concerned eyes met hers like a lifeline. In that fleeting moment, Amina felt both comforted and exposed, as though Zainab's understanding gaze could see straight through the veil she wore. The sacred tree loomed over them all, its branches swaying gently in the breeze as if whispering secrets of its own. The villagers' attention remained fixed on the couple, but an undercurrent of tension rippled through the crowd. It wasn't loud, it wasn't spoken, but it was there. A quiet unease no one dared to name. The final segment of the ceremony began with the lighting of the unity flame, a tradition symbolizing the merging of two lives into one. Amina and Kwame each held a small candle, their flames trembling as they moved toward the central lantern. The crowd leaned forward, captivated by the beauty of the moment, but Amina's hand shook so visibly that Kwame reached over to steady her. The gesture, though gentle, drew a few whispers from the villagers. To many, it seemed like a display of affection. To others, it was a subtle sign of her inner struggle. As the unity flame burned brightly, the elders began their final blessings, their voices rising in unison like a sacred chant carried on the wind. Elder Bayo stepped forward, his deep voice resonating as he declared the couple bound by tradition and love. His words carried weight, but his eyes lingered on Amina, searching for answers she was unwilling or unable to give. The villagers erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the open space, yet the applause did little to dispel the tension lingering beneath the surface. Amina's mother stood near the edge of the crowd, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her expression was a mixture of pride and worry, her heart warring between the joy of the occasion and the nagging feeling that her daughter was hiding something. As the villagers surged forward to congratulate the couple, she hung back, her eyes fixed on Amina, searching for a sign that everything was truly as it seemed. But Amina's smile, though radiant, felt fragile, like a mask that could shatter at any moment. The villagers formed a procession, leading the newlyweds toward the feast prepared in their honor. The drummers played lively rhythms, and the dancers swayed in time with the beats, their movements full of joy. Yet, as Amina walked alongside Kwame, her steps grew slower, her breath shallower. Zainab, following close behind, noticed immediately, her heart sinking as she watched her friend's shoulders tense with each passing moment. The celebration carried on around them, oblivious to the storm brewing in Amina's heart. The sound of drums and laughter filled the air as the procession reached the grand feast. Tables were laden with an abundance of food, steaming yams, roasted meats, and sweetened pastries that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. Amina walked alongside Kwame, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her posture graceful despite the mounting tension within her. The villagers surrounded them with cheers and blessings, their voices rising like a chorus of joy. But amidst the celebration, Amina's steps faltered, her grip on Kwame's arm tightening ever so slightly. Kwame turned to her, concern flashing across his face, but Amina quickly plastered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice betrayed the strain she was feeling. The crowd continued to clap and cheer, oblivious to the exchange. Zainab, walking a few paces behind, noticed the slight sheen of sweat on Amina's brow and the subtle way she kept pressing a hand against her abdomen. Something was wrong, and Zainab's intuition screamed at her to act, but she hesitated, unwilling to disrupt the joyous occasion. As the couple approached the head table, Amina paused, her face tightening in a grimace. Her breathing became shallow and a soft gasp escaped her lips, drawing the attention of those closest to her. "Amina?" Kwame asked, his voice laced with worry. Before she could respond, her legs gave way beneath her, and she crumpled to the ground. The crowd froze, the festive atmosphere replaced by a stunned silence. Only the distant rhythm of the drums continued, an eerie echo of the celebration that had come to an abrupt halt. Chaos erupted as the villagers rushed forward, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of concern and confusion. Kwame knelt beside Amina, his hands trembling as he tried to support her. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice breaking. Amina clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain, and a piercing cry tore through the air. It was a sound that silenced even the most frantic whispers. The realization struck the crowd like a lightning bolt. Amina was in labor. The realization spread through the crowd like wildfire, their stunned faces reflecting a mix of shock and disbelief. Labor? Now? One voice questioned, while others murmured in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the unfolding chaos. Elder Bayo stepped forward, his commanding presence cutting through the noise. "Clear the area!" he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The villagers quickly stepped back, forming a wide circle around Amina and Kwame. The once festive atmosphere had transformed into a charged silence, broken only by Amina's labored breaths. Kwame knelt beside Amina, his hands hovering helplessly as he tried to console her. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. Amina's eyes fluttered open, meeting his gaze for a fleeting moment. "It's coming," she managed to say through gritted teeth, her voice a mixture of pain and determination. The elder women, led by midwife Adjoa, rushed forward, their movements swift and purposeful. "Bring water and cloths," Adjoa commanded, her voice cutting through the mounting tension. The villagers stood frozen, their emotions ranging from confusion to judgment. Fatima, the village gossip, leaned toward a neighbor and whispered, "How could this happen? On her wedding day?" Her words dripped with scorn, but Zainab, standing nearby, shot her a glare that silenced her. Zainab pushed through the crowd and knelt beside Amina, taking her hand. "I'm here," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Amina squeezed her hand, her grip strong despite the pain racking her body. The sacred tree loomed over the scene, its ancient branches casting dappled shadows on the ground. It stood as a silent witness to the unfolding drama, its roots seemingly anchored in both the past and the present. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their authority shaken by the unexpected turn of events. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a moment that would ripple through the fabric of the community, forcing them to confront truths they had yet to understand. The once celebratory crowd now hovered anxiously, their gazes fixed on Amina as her cries of pain echoed through the clearing. Midwife Adjoa worked with practiced precision, her hands steady as she assessed the situation. "We need space," she barked, her authority slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. The villagers shuffled back further, creating a makeshift boundary around the unfolding scene. Kwame stayed by Amina's side, his face pale but determined. He gripped her hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. Zainab remained close, her presence a source of comfort for Amina, who clung to her friend's hand as if it were a lifeline. "Breathe, Amina," Zainab urged, her voice soft but firm. Amina nodded weakly, her breaths coming in uneven gasps. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. The villagers whispered among themselves, their words a mixture of concern, speculation, and judgment. Elder Bayo, standing on the outskirts of the circle, observed it all in silence, his expression unreadable, but his mind clearly working through the implications. As Amina let out another sharp cry, the village seemed to hold its collective breath. The sacred tree, ever present and unyielding, stood as a silent sentinel, its ancient roots entwined with the drama unfolding beneath it. Midwife Adjoa's voice cut through the stillness. "It's close. Stay strong, Amina." Her words carried a weight that seemed to steady not only Amina but everyone present. Even the skeptics, like Fatima, fell silent, their judgment temporarily overshadowed by the gravity of the moment. Then, piercing through the heavy air, came the sound that no one could have anticipated. A baby's first cry. The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs, the weight of the moment hitting everyone like a tidal wave. Adjoa lifted the newborn into her arms, her experienced hands cradling the tiny, squirming body. "It's a boy," she announced, her voice filled with a strange blend of relief and triumph. The villagers stared in stunned silence, their emotions ranging from joy to bewilderment. This was no longer just a wedding day. It had become a story that would echo through generations. The village buzzed with whispers, the once festive energy now replaced by a charged atmosphere of speculation. Groups of villagers huddled together, their voices low but animated as they tried to piece together the shocking events. "A baby during the wedding? What could this mean?" murmured one woman, her tone laced with disbelief. Fatima, ever the gossip, was quick to stoke the flames. "She has disgraced Kwame and the community," she declared, her words dripping with judgment. Her audience nodded solemnly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. Meanwhile, Amina was carried into a private room, her newborn cradled in her arms. Zainab stayed close, her presence a shield against the brewing storm of accusations. Amina's face was pale, her exhaustion evident, but her grip on the child was firm. "You're safe now," Zainab whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Amina's face. Outside, the voices of the villagers grew louder, their murmurs threatening to burst into outright chaos. Kwame stood near the door, his expression torn between concern for Amina and the weight of the villagers' growing discontent. Elder Bayo called for order, his deep voice booming over the crowd. "Enough of this senseless chatter," he commanded, silencing the immediate noise. The villagers turned to him, their attention momentarily diverted from their suspicions. "This is a time for clarity, not division," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. But even his authority couldn't completely quell the unease that hung in the air. The villagers exchanged glances, their thoughts unspoken but clearly written on their faces. Doubt, anger, and confusion churned beneath their silence. Kwame's family stood apart, their expressions tight with a mix of shock and shame. His mother, who had been so proud just hours before, now avoided meeting anyone's eyes. "This is unacceptable," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with anger. But Kwame, standing tall despite the weight pressing down on him, raised a hand to quiet her. "Not now," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze moved toward the room where Amina rested, his heart heavy with 1,000 questions but anchored by a single truth. He needed to stand by her no matter what. As the crowd outside the room grew restless, their whispers turned into heated exchanges. Some villagers, like Elder Fatima, argued that Amina's actions had brought shame upon the sacred institution of marriage. "What kind of woman hides such a thing on her wedding day?" she spat, her voice sharp and cutting. Others, like a younger woman named Casey, attempted to defend her. "We don't know her story," Casey countered, her tone pleading. But the divide was clear. Half the crowd leaned into judgment, while the other half hesitated, unsure of what to believe. Inside, Amina sat upright, her child swaddled and sleeping in her arms. Her eyes were distant, staring at nothing in particular, as if replaying the events that had led her to this moment. Zainab knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Amina's shoulder. "You don't owe them an explanation," she said softly, but Amina shook her head. "I do," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the villagers' anger pressed heavily on her chest, but it was nothing compared to the burden of the truth she had kept hidden for so long. Kwame stood near the door, listening to the murmurs outside. His mind raced, torn between loyalty to Amina and the expectations of his family and community. His mother approached him, her face etched with worry. "You can't let this ruin you," she said, her voice urgent. "You have to think of your name. Our name." Kwame turned to her, his jaw tight with determination. "And what about Amina? What about our child?" he shot back, his voice low but firm. His mother faltered, unable to meet his gaze. "This is bigger than you, Kwame," she whispered. But he shook his head. "No, it's not," he replied. Outside, Elder Bayo called for a gathering at the village square, his booming voice cutting through the tension. "We will not resolve this with rumors," he declared. "The council will meet and the truth will be heard." The crowd began to disperse, their curiosity piqued, but their anger simmering just beneath the surface. Kwame glanced back at Amina before stepping outside, his heart heavy with uncertainty but resolute in his decision to face whatever came next. The village square, usually a place of celebrations and communal gatherings, now felt heavy with tension. The villagers filed in slowly, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and unease. Elder Bayo stood at the center, his presence commanding attention. "This is a matter of great importance," he began, his voice steady. "We must approach it with fairness and wisdom." His words silenced the murmurs, but the charged atmosphere lingered. Zainab arrived shortly after, her arm wrapped protectively around Amina, who held her child close to her chest. Every step Amina took felt like walking through fire, the judgmental stares piercing her resolve. Fatima, ever eager to stir discord, stepped forward. "How can we pretend this hasn't brought shame to our community?" she asked, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We must protect our traditions." Her words were met with nods of agreement, but Kessie's voice rose above the murmurs. "And what of compassion?" Kessie countered, her tone sharp. "Do we not owe Amina the chance to speak?" A ripple of uncertainty spread through the crowd as they looked to Elder Bayo for guidance. His expression remained calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his thoughts. Kwame stepped into the square, his tall frame radiating a quiet strength. His arrival caused a stir, with villagers whispering among themselves about what his stance might be. He ignored the murmurs, his focus fixed on Amina and the child in her arms. Standing beside her, he addressed the crowd. "Amina is my wife," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "And this child is a part of me now. Whatever judgment you cast on her, you cast on me as well." His words hung in the air, silencing even the most vocal critics. For a moment, the weight of tradition clashed with the raw power of his conviction. Elder Bayo stepped forward again, his hand raised for silence. "Let us not forget who we are," he said, his tone measured. "We are a community, bound by more than our traditions. If we do not listen, if we do not seek understanding, then we are lost." His words resonated, their gravity settling over the villagers like a heavy cloak. Slowly, the crowd began to shift, their anger tempered by the seeds of doubt and reflection. But beneath the surface, tensions remained, and the full truth had yet to emerge. The small room where Amina rested was filled with a tense but tender energy. The midwife, Adjoa, moved with practiced ease, her hands steady as she tended to the newborn. The baby boy let out soft cries, his tiny hands grasping at the air, unaware of the turmoil outside. Amina cradled him close, her exhaustion evident but overshadowed by a fierce protectiveness. Zainab sat beside her, dabbing a cool cloth across Amina's brow. "You're stronger than they know," Zainab whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. Amina gave a weak nod, her grip on the baby tightening as if drawing strength from his presence. Outside, the village buzzed with fragmented conversations, the square still alive with speculation and tension. Kwame stood at the door, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the curious onlookers who lingered nearby. He exchanged a glance with Adjoa, who nodded subtly, signaling that Amina and the child were stable. Relief flickered across his face, but it was fleeting. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. His family's voices echoed in his mind, their expectations and disapproval weighing heavily on him. Still, he refused to let their judgment dictate his next move. The elders began to gather at the council meeting, their expressions serious as they prepared to address the situation. Elder Bayo's voice carried above the murmurs. "The child is here, and that cannot be undone. But how we respond will define us as a community." His words were measured, seeking to ground the group in reason, yet even he felt the weight of the unspoken questions swirling among them. How had this come to pass? What did it mean for the unity of the village? The answers, they knew, lay with Amina, and the burden of truth loomed large. Back in the room, Amina's breath steadied as she watched the baby's small chest rise and fall. "What will they do to us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Zainab met her gaze, her expression resolute. "They'll have to face the truth," she said firmly. Kwame stepped into the room then, his presence grounding them both. He knelt beside Amina, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll face it together," he promised, his voice steady despite the storm raging outside. Amina looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that they might survive this, no matter what came next. The cries of the newborn carried softly through the air, a fragile sound that seemed to hold both hope and uncertainty. Amina adjusted the blanket around the baby, her hands trembling as she ensured his warmth. Midwife Adjoa leaned close, her voice steady and reassuring. "He's strong," she said, her experienced eyes assessing the child. Amina nodded, but her mind was far from at ease. Each second felt like a borrowed moment, stolen from the inevitable reckoning awaiting them outside. Her eyes flicked to Kwame, who stood watchfully at the door, his back straight as if bracing himself for a storm. In the square, the villagers' conversations grew louder, their emotions flaring into arguments. "How can we celebrate this?" one voice demanded. "This isn't how things are done," another villager countered. "Doesn't the child deserve a chance?" "Amina deserves a chance." The divide in the crowd became clearer with each exchange, the tension like a tightly wound rope ready to snap. Elder Fatima, frowning deeply, approached Elder Bayo. "This situation demands action," she said sharply. Elder Bayo nodded but replied calmly, "And it will have action, but not without understanding." His words, though measured, did little to soothe Fatima's impatience. Inside the room, Kwame finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "We need to tell them the truth." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Amina's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "The truth?" she echoed, her voice trembling. Zainab placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's right," Zainab said softly. "They won't stop until they have answers, and it's better if they hear it from you." Amina's grip on the baby tightened, her mind racing through the possibilities. The truth was her burden, but sharing it felt like walking into a fire she wasn't sure she could withstand. Adjoa cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "Whatever you decide, do it with strength," she said, her tone carrying the weight of wisdom. "This child came into the world today, and that means something. Don't let fear decide what happens next." Her words struck a chord in the room, grounding them all in the gravity of the moment. Kwame knelt beside Amina, his hand covering hers. "We'll face it together," he said again, his voice filled with resolve. Amina met his gaze, and though her fear remained, a spark of courage flickered within her. The baby stirred in Amina's arms, his small movements grounding her in the present moment. She gazed at him, her heart a tumult of fear and fierce love. "He's innocent," she whispered, as if reminding herself. Kwame reached out, gently brushing the baby's cheek with his finger. "He's ours now," he said firmly, his words carrying an unshakable conviction. Amina's eyes brimmed with tears as she looked at him, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Despite the uncertainty surrounding them, there was no denying the bond they shared in that moment. Fragile, yet profound. Outside, the elders prepared for the council meeting, their expressions tense as they deliberated their next steps. The village square buzzed with anticipation, the crowd eager to hear what would be decided. "This child changes everything," one elder remarked, his voice grave. "It's not just about Amina and Kwame anymore." Elder Bayo, seated at the head of the group, raised a hand for silence. "Before we judge, we must hear the full story," he said, his voice calm but firm. His words carried weight, calming some of the agitation but leaving the villagers hungry for answers. Back in the small room, Zainab stood, her expression resolute. "It's time," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Amina hesitated, her fear bubbling to the surface once more. "What if they don't believe me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zainab knelt in front of her, taking her free hand. "Then we'll stand by you," she said firmly. "The truth matters, Amina, and you're not alone." Kwame nodded in agreement, his hand resting on Amina's shoulder. "We'll face this together," he repeated, his voice steady. With a deep breath, Amina stood, the baby still cradled in her arms. Her steps were hesitant, but the resolve in her eyes began to grow. Zainab opened the door, revealing the square filled with villagers and elders alike. The noise of the crowd quieted as Amina stepped forward, Kwame by her side and Zainab close behind. All eyes turned to her, the weight of their judgment palpable. But in that moment, Amina chose to focus on the small, steady breaths of the child in her arms. With her heart pounding, she prepared to speak, knowing the truth would finally be revealed. The crowd fell into a tense silence as Amina stepped into the center of the square, her figure illuminated by the fading light of the day. The elders sat in a semicircle, their expressions expectant but guarded, while the villagers stood in hushed anticipation. Kwame remained by her side, his hand lightly resting on her back in a silent gesture of support. Amina's grip tightened on the baby, the soft warmth of his small body grounding her amidst the weight of countless eyes. Her voice trembled as she began, but determination laced her words. "I need you to know the truth," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity laced with judgment. Fatima crossed her arms, a skeptical look etched across her face. "Let her speak," Elder Bayo commanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Amina inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as she prepared to share the burden she had carried for months. "What happened? It wasn't my choice," she began, her voice faltering. The crowd leaned in, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion. Zainab stood a step behind Amina, her presence radiating silent encouragement. Amina's words tumbled out, slow at first, but gaining momentum as she recounted the events that had haunted her. "Months ago, a traitor came to the village," she explained, her voice cracking. "Jabari, he forced himself on me." Gasps erupted from the crowd, shock rippling like a wave through the villagers. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, while others looked away, struggling to process the revelation. Kwame stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words sank in. "I was scared. I thought no one would believe me," Amina continued, tears streaming down her face. The silence that followed was deafening. Elder Fatima's sharp expression softened, and even her lips parted in quiet disbelief. Elder Bayo leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he absorbed the gravity of Amina's confession. "Jabari," he repeated, his voice low but laced with an undercurrent of anger. The name seemed to linger in the air, heavy with implications. The villagers remained frozen, the weight of the truth forcing them to reconsider their judgments. For the first time since the wedding day began, Amina felt a flicker of relief. She had spoken her truth. The tension in the air was palpable, every villager wrestling with their thoughts as Amina's revelation sank in. Fatima, who had been the loudest critic earlier, now looked visibly shaken. She clutched the edge of her shawl, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Why didn't she say anything before?" someone murmured from the crowd. "Would you?" Zainab shot back, her voice steady but cutting. The question silenced the whispers, forcing everyone to confront the harsh reality of Amina's experience. For the first time, the villagers began to see the weight of her silence, not as guilt, but as survival. Elder Bayo stood, his commanding presence quieting even the faintest murmurs. "We are not here to judge what she endured," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "We are here to decide how we move forward." His words resonated with the gravity of the moment, drawing nods from several elders. Yet not everyone was ready to let go of their anger. Kwame's uncle, a stern man named Aid, stepped forward. "And what of Jabari?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Will we let him go unpunished?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger shifting from Amina to the man who had wronged her. Amina clutched her child tightly, her body trembling as she spoke again. "I didn't want to ruin this day for Kwame or his family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe if I stayed silent I could protect everyone. Her words hung in the air, a painful reminder of the sacrifices she had made for the sake of others. Kwame, standing tall beside her, finally spoke. "You didn't ruin anything, Amina," he said firmly, his voice carrying a weight of conviction. "If anything, your strength saved this day." His words drew a ripple of murmurs from the crowd, some nodding in quiet agreement. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of contemplation and sorrow. Elder Fatima, her usual sharp demeanor softened, cleared her throat. "It is clear she has suffered greatly," she said, her tone uncharacteristically gentle. "But we must decide as a community what to do now." Elder Bayo nodded in agreement. "First, we must ensure that Jabari is held accountable," he said. "And second, we must decide how to support Amina and this child." His words set the tone for the rest of the meeting, shifting the focus from blame to justice and restoration. The crowd stirred uneasily as Elder Bayo's words settled over them, his call for accountability striking a chord. "Jabari must face the consequences," a voice called out from the back, earning nods of agreement. The villagers, once divided in their judgment of Amina, now began to direct their outrage toward the traitor who had violated her trust. Fatima, who had been quick to criticize earlier, stepped forward, her voice shaking with a newfound resolve. "If this man dared to harm one of our own, he must answer for it," she said, her sharpness replaced by a protective fierceness. Kwame, standing tall beside Amina, addressed the crowd. "Amina has carried this burden alone for too long," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today, we must carry it with her, not just for her sake, but for the child, our child, who deserves to grow up in a community that stands for justice." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the villagers. Zainab, standing close to Amina, added, "If we do nothing, we fail her. And we fail ourselves." Her words further solidified the shifting mood of the crowd, their judgment giving way to solidarity. The elders conferred quietly among themselves, their expressions heavy with the responsibility of their role. Elder Bayo raised his hand, calling for silence once more. "We will send word to neighboring villages about Jabari," he announced, his tone firm. "He must be brought to justice, and we will ensure he answers for his actions." The villagers responded with a collective nod, their resolve now focused on finding the man who had caused so much harm. Yet the moment remained bittersweet. Justice, though necessary, could not erase the pain Amina had endured. As the meeting came to a close, Amina felt a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone in carrying the truth. The villagers began to disperse, their voices low but less hostile than before. Kwame turned to her, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. "We'll get through this," he said, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Amina nodded, her grip on their child tightening as she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt the first flickers of strength returning, a strength she knew would carry her forward. The early morning sun cast a soft glow over the village as Kwame sat outside his family's hut, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the previous day. The voices of the villagers still echoed in his mind, some supportive, others skeptical. His mother emerged from the hut, her expression as tight as her crossed arms. "You cannot ignore what this means, Kwame," she said, her tone firm but tinged with worry. "Your duty is to your family and our name. This situation, it's complicated." Kwame met her gaze, his jaw set with quiet determination. "It's not complicated to me," he replied. His father joined them, sitting down with a sigh. "Son, no one is saying you shouldn't care for the child," he began, his voice measured. "But bringing them both into our family like this, it will change everything. The villagers will talk, and you must think of the future." Kwame clenched his fists, his frustration evident. "What kind of future would I have if I abandoned them?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Amina didn't ask for any of this, and neither did the child. They deserve to be protected, not cast aside." His words hung in the air, unyielding. Inside the small room where Amina rested, Zainab helped her prepare for the day. Amina's movements were slow, her body still recovering, but her resolve was growing. "Do you think he'll choose us?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with vulnerability. Zainab placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Kwame loves you," she said firmly. "He's not like the others. You've seen it in how he's stood by you already." Amina nodded, her heart wavering between hope and fear. The child stirred in her arms, his tiny movements a reminder of all she had to fight for. Kwame stood, his mother reaching out to stop him. "Think carefully," she warned, her voice trembling. "Once you make this decision, there's no going back." Kwame turned to her, his expression resolute. "I've already decided," he said simply. He walked toward the room where Amina and the baby waited, his footsteps firm against the packed earth. The morning air felt heavier with each step, but in his heart, there was no doubt. He had chosen his path, and now he needed to make it known, to Amina, to his family, and to the entire village. Kwame pushed open the door to the small room, his presence filling the space with quiet strength. Amina looked up, her heart pounding as their eyes met. She searched his face for a sign of what he was feeling, but his expression was unreadable. "Amina," he began, his voice steady but soft. "We need to talk." Zainab glanced between them, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I'll give you two some privacy," she said, rising from her seat and leaving the room. The door creaked softly as it closed, leaving Kwame and Amina alone with their child. Amina's grip on the baby tightened as she braced herself for what Kwame might say. "I know this isn't how you imagined our lives starting," he said, sitting beside her. "It's not how I imagined it either, but none of that matters now." His words were calm, deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed them in his mind a dozen times. "What matters is that we face this together. You, me, and him," he said, glancing down at the baby with a softness that melted Amina's fears, even if only for a moment. Tears welled up in Amina's eyes, but she held them back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Do you mean that? After everything that's happened? After what people are saying about me?" Kwame reached for her free hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Let them talk," he said, his tone resolute. "They don't know what we've been through, and they don't get to decide what we do next. This is our family now, Amina, and I'm not going anywhere." His words carried a finality that sent a wave of relief and gratitude through her. Outside, the murmurs of the village continued, the tension palpable as people speculated about what Kwame would do. His family lingered near the square, his mother pacing while his father stood with arms crossed. "He's been in there too long," his mother muttered. "What if he's made up his mind already?" His father shook his head. "Then we'll have to accept it, whether we like it or not," he replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely ready to let go of his expectations. Whatever decision Kwame was about to announce, it would reshape their family and the village forever. Kwame emerged from the small room, his steps deliberate as he walked into the open square where the villagers had gathered. The morning sun bathed the space in a warm glow, but the tension in the air remained unshaken. His mother and father stood near the edge of the crowd, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions unreadable. Zainab followed behind him, standing quietly to the side as if ready to support him at any moment. Kwame's gaze swept over the crowd, his jaw tightening as he prepared to speak. "I know many of you have questions," he began, his voice steady but loud enough to carry across the square. "And I know some of you have already made up your minds about Amina, about our child, about me." His words hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the crowd. "But let me be clear. Amina is my wife, and this child is my son. Whatever judgments you have, you can bring them to me." His tone was firm, his words cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "I will not abandon them, no matter what anyone says." The crowd shifted uneasily, their expressions ranging from approval to skepticism. Elder Bayo stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the villagers. "Kwame has spoken with clarity and conviction," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years. "It is not for us to tear down what he has chosen to build. Our role as a community is to support one another, especially in times of hardship." His words silenced much of the crowd, though a few dissenting voices could still be heard. Fatima crossed her arms but remained quiet, her earlier sharpness now tempered by the unfolding events. Kwame turned back toward the small room, where Amina stood in the doorway holding their child. The sight of her, framed by the soft light filtering through the hut, brought a small, steadying smile to his face. "This is my family," he said, his voice softer but no less resolute, "and together we'll face whatever comes next." The crowd murmured, their whispers shifting from judgment to reluctant acceptance. Amina stepped forward, her gaze meeting Kwame's as she walked to his side. For the first time, the tension in the square began to ease, leaving room for something new: hope. The elders gathered beneath the sacred tree, their expressions solemn as they prepared for the ritual. The sprawling branches above cast dappled shadows on the ground, their movement in the breeze like a silent witness to the day's events. Elder Bayo stood at the center, his voice carrying the weight of generations as he addressed the villagers. "Today, we seek to heal, to restore harmony," he began, his gaze moving across the gathered faces. "This ritual is not just for Amina and her child, but for all of us. It is a reminder of who we are and who we strive to be." The villagers formed a wide circle around the elders, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. At the center of the gathering, a small altar had been arranged with symbols of the community's unity: baskets of grains, pots of water, and a single lit candle. Amina and Kwame stood nearby, holding their child between them. Amina's heart raced as she glanced at the crowd, their judgmental stares now softened by the weight of the ritual's purpose. Kwame gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, his quiet strength grounding her. The ritual began with a prayer, led by Elder Fatima, whose voice, though sharp in tone, carried a surprising gentleness. "We call upon the spirits of our ancestors, she intoned, her words echoing through the clearing. Guide us as we seek forgiveness and renewal. The villagers repeated her words in unison, their voices weaving together like threads in a tapestry. Amina closed her eyes, her breaths aligning with the rhythm of the prayer. In that moment, she felt a flicker of peace. Small, but significant. Elder Bayo stepped forward, holding a bowl of water infused with herbs. He sprinkled it in a wide arc, the droplets shimmering in the sunlight as they fell. This water cleanses not just the body, but the spirit, he explained. Let it wash away our anger, our fear, and our division. The villagers watched in silence, the weight of his words settling over them. Some nodded, their expressions softening, while others remained hesitant. But as the water fell, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. As Elder Bayo continued the ritual, he motioned for Amina and Kwame to step forward. The couple approached the altar, their movements deliberate, each step carrying the weight of expectation. Amina held her child tightly, the baby stirring slightly but remaining calm. Kwame placed a steadying hand on her back as they knelt before the elders. This family seeks acceptance, Elder Bayo declared, his voice clear and unwavering. Let us extend to them the grace that binds us as one community. His words carried a solemnity that seemed to resonate with everyone present. Fatima, holding a small vessel of oil, stepped forward with cautious determination. She hesitated briefly, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd before focusing on Amina. This oil represents healing, she said, her tone softer than usual. She anointed Amina's forehead with a single touch, then the baby's, her actions deliberate and precise. May this child grow in strength and wisdom, she said, her voice steady. The villagers watched intently, some nodding in quiet approval. Fatima's participation, though unexpected, marked a significant shift in the atmosphere, a step toward reconciliation. The drummers, seated near the edge of the circle, began a soft rhythm, their hands moving with practiced grace. The beat was slow and steady, a grounding pulse that seemed to mirror the heart of the ritual. Elder Bayo lifted the lit candle from the altar and held it high. This flame represents the light of understanding, he said. May it guide us through darkness and uncertainty. He handed the candle to Kwame, who held it carefully as the elders chanted in unison. The crowd joined in, their voices hesitant at first but growing stronger with each verse. Amina, kneeling beside Kwame, felt a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just the physical heat of the flame, but the intangible comfort of being surrounded by her community, their voices rising in harmony. For the first time, the collective energy felt less like judgment and more like support. The baby let out a soft coo, drawing a ripple of smiles from those closest to the couple. Amina glanced at Zainab, standing in the crowd with a proud smile, and felt a surge of gratitude. The ritual was working. Slowly, but undeniably, it was mending what had been broken. As the chanting subsided, Elder Bayo placed the candle back on the altar, its flame flickering gently in the breeze. Let this moment remind us of our shared humanity, he said, his voice steady. We are not perfect, but together we are stronger. The villagers stood in silence, absorbing his words. The ritual had softened many hearts, their earlier skepticism replaced with a cautious sense of unity. Even those who had been vocal critics, like Fatima, now appeared contemplative, their expressions less rigid, their postures less guarded. Elder Fatima stepped forward once more, this time holding a woven cloth dyed in the vibrant colors of the village's heritage. This cloth symbolizes our connection to one another, she explained. As we wrap it around this family, we affirm their place among us. With careful movements, she draped the cloth over Amina, Kwame, and their baby, the bright fabric creating a striking contrast against the muted tones of the earth beneath them. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of approval and relief. The gesture was simple, yet it carried profound meaning. The drummers picked up their rhythm, this time faster and more lively, signaling the shift from solemnity to celebration. The crowd began to clap in time with the beat, their earlier hesitations giving way to a tentative joy. Zainab was the first to step forward, placing a hand on Amina's shoulder. You've always been one of us, she said, her voice filled with emotion. One by one, other villagers followed suit, offering words of encouragement, congratulations, or quiet apologies. The circle around the family tightened, not in judgment, but in solidarity. As the ritual drew to a close, Amina looked around the square, her vision blurring with tears. What had begun as a day of fear and uncertainty now felt like the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild, not just for her family, but for the entire community. Kwame squeezed her hand, his smile steady and reassuring. We're home, he said softly. Amina nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. The villagers began to disperse, their voices carrying hints of laughter and song. Under the shade of the sacred tree, Amina and Kwame stood together, wrapped in the embrace of their village, ready to face whatever came next. The days following the ritual were filled with a quiet, steady transformation within the village. The sharp edges of judgment and whispers softened, replaced by gestures of support and cautious acceptance. Amina walked through the village square with the baby cradled in her arms, her steps more confident than they had been in months. Villagers who once avoided her now offered warm smiles or kind greetings. "He's growing strong," an elder remarked, nodding toward the child. Amina smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she responded, "Yes, he is." The words felt like an affirmation, not just for her son, but for herself. Kwame worked tirelessly to repair the family's home, the small hut buzzing with renewed energy. Zainab often visited, bringing fresh food or simply sitting with Amina to share stories and laughter. "You've always been stronger than you know," Zainab said one afternoon as they sat beneath the shade of the sacred tree. Amina glanced at her friend, gratitude flickering in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The bond between them, forged through years of friendship and tested by recent trials, had only grown stronger. The villagers began to include Amina in their daily routines once more, inviting her to gatherings and seeking her advice on small matters. It wasn't a complete return to normalcy. There were still lingering stares, hesitant pauses in conversation, but it was progress. The elders, led by Bayo, continued to emphasize the importance of unity in their public speeches. "This village thrives when we stand together," he reminded them during a community meeting. His words carried the weight of their shared experiences, resonating deeply with those who had witnessed the turmoil firsthand. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a warm golden light, Kwame and Amina sat outside their home with their child. The baby giggled softly, his tiny hands reaching for the fireflies that danced in the twilight. Kwame wrapped an arm around Amina's shoulders, pulling her close. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. Amina leaned into him, her heart full as she whispered, "And we'll go even further." The challenges they had faced had reshaped their lives, but they had emerged stronger. Together. The village gradually settled into its rhythm, but the events surrounding Amina and Kwame left a lasting impression. The sacred tree, once a backdrop for judgment, had become a symbol of renewal. Villagers often gathered there, not to gossip, but to share stories of resilience and forgiveness. Amina, once hesitant to join these gatherings, now sat among them, her baby cradled in her arms as she listened and occasionally shared her thoughts. "Every storm passes," Elder Fatima said during one such gathering, her words carrying a tone of reflection. "What matters is how we rebuild afterward." Amina nodded, feeling the truth in those words. Kwame's decision to stand by Amina continued to spark conversations within the village. Some saw it as an act of defiance against tradition, while others viewed it as a testament to love and courage. Kwame, however, dismissed the debates. "I did what was right for my family," he often said, brushing off both praise and criticism. His focus remained on building a stable future, one that allowed Amina and their child to thrive. The small farm they worked together began to flourish, a reflection of their shared determination. Zainab, ever the loyal friend, remained a pillar of support. "Your story has changed this village, Amina," she said one afternoon as they prepared food together. Amina looked at her, surprise flickering across her face. "Changed?" she asked. Zainab smiled. "People are kinder now, more thoughtful. They're learning to see beyond appearances, beyond tradition." Amina considered her friend's words, a sense of quiet pride blooming in her chest. Though her journey had been painful, it had also paved the way for something greater, an unspoken shift in the village's collective heart. Even the elders, who once hesitated to fully embrace Amina's place in the community, began to seek her perspective. During council meetings, Elder Bayo would often nod in her direction, silently inviting her thoughts. At first, Amina spoke cautiously, unsure of how her words would be received, but over time, her confidence grew, and her contributions became an integral part of the discussions. "Wisdom is born from experience," Bayo remarked one evening, his tone thoughtful. "And you, Amina, have lived through much." The acknowledgement warmed her spirit, solidifying her sense of belonging. On a crisp morning, the village gathered for a naming ceremony under the sacred tree, an event that carried deep cultural significance. Amina and Kwame stood before the elders, their child swaddled in a vibrant cloth that reflected the colors of their heritage. The crowd hummed with anticipation, their expressions a mixture of joy and curiosity. Elder Bayo stepped forward, holding a small bowl of water infused with herbs. "This child has already brought change to our community," he began, his voice filled with reverence. "Today, we honor him and the strength of the family that brought him here." Amina's heart swelled with emotion as the ceremony unfolded. The elders spoke blessings over the child, each word weaving a tapestry of hope and protection. Kwame stood proudly beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. When the time came to announce the name, Amina's voice was steady, clear. Kofi, she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. It means born on a Friday. The villagers erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the clearing. Kofi, unaware of the significance of the moment, let out a small coo, drawing laughter from the crowd. As the celebration continued, the villagers embraced Amina and Kwame, their earlier doubts and divisions now replaced by a sense of unity. Zainab held Kofi for a moment, cradling him with practiced ease. He has your strength, she said to Amina, her voice warm with affection. Amina smiled, watching her son with a mixture of pride and hope. The past months had been a trial by fire, but standing here now, she felt the weight of those hardships begin to lift. This wasn't just a new chapter for her family. It was a fresh start for the entire village. That evening, as the festivities wound down and the villagers returned to their homes, Amina and Kwame sat beneath the sacred tree. The stars above were bright, their light spilling across the village like a blessing. Kofi slept soundly in Amina's arms, his small breaths blending with the quiet rustle of the wind. We made it, Kwame said softly, his hand finding hers. Amina turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. Together, she replied. The sacred tree stood tall above them, its branches stretching toward the heavens, a silent testament to their resilience, their love, and their hope for the future. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Amina's story, a story of love, resilience, and the transformative power of truth. It's incredible how one moment, one decision, can reshape not just a family, but an entire community. Now I'd love to hear from you. Tell us, where are you watching this from? Share your country, your city, and let's connect through the stories that unite us. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any of the inspiring stories we have coming next. Together, we're building a space for stories that matter. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the strength we all carry within. Until next time, stay inspired, stay connected, and remember, every challenge holds the seed of a new beginning. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.